Good evening, everyone. My name's Sammy. I'm the course coordinator for Food Literacy for All, and today we have the pleasure of being joined by Jayson Maurice Porter, who will be giving a talk on researching, writing, and teaching Black environmental histories and ecologies of diaspora. If you're new to Food Literacy for All is hosted by the University of Michigan Sustainable Food Systems Initiative, and it's structured as an evening lecture series featuring different guest speakers each week to address diverse challenges and opportunities of both domestic and global food systems. To give a bit more information about Food Literacy for All, it is co-led by Dr. Benedict Boisseron, who is the professor and chair of Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan, as well as co-instructed by Shiloh Maples, a community organizer, seed keeper, and storyteller. We also have community partners that help make this course possible. Oops, 1 second, sorry about that. This includes Oakland Avenue Urban Farm, the Detroit Food Policy Council, and the Detroit Black Community Food Sovereignty Network. And they help collaborate on the course each year. Other team members that help make this course possible include Taylor Julene, who is our graduate student instructor, Sai Sharuvu, the Sustainable Food Systems Initiative or SFSI coordinator, Dr. Leslie Huey, Chris Taylor, who is our technology help, as well as Tiffany Harris, the Food Literacy for All grader. Food Literacy for All is presented by the Sustainable Food Systems Initiative, and we receive support from the Center for the Education of Women Plus and their Francis and Sydney Lewis Visiting Leaders Fund, as well as the School for Environment and Sustainability and the Program in the Environment. There are several different ways to engage with Food Literacy for All. We are on X and Instagram. We also have poll questions, which students will complete on iClicker. And if you are a community member, so not enrolled in the course as a student, if you're a community member, you will be able to answer the poll questions through Zoom. You can also use the Q&A feature on Zoom today to ask Jayson questions throughout the talk, and we will have some time at the end of the talk to have those questions answered. Also, all of the classes are filmed and uploaded on the Sustainable Food Systems Initiative website. And next we have a student response from Maya or Mia. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. And this is a response from the readings that Jayson shared for this week.
In his interview with Public Books magazine, Dr. Jayson M. Porter introduces the concept of what it means to be a public thinker. Now, if you search a public thinker online like I did, you may find a lot of different definitions, as well as some pictures of statues thinking. So, what does it really mean to be a public thinker? To Dr. Porter, part of it is the ability to think out loud and in public, in a public-facing way that hopefully makes people see his curiosity and join him. He also emphasizes how vulnerability and healing lend itself to public thinking. Essentially, nuanced conversations require mutual trust, so vulnerability and healing are ways to build the trust. In my opinion, public thinking is the response of a bigger cultural phenomenon happening in the 21st century. We are currently living in a world, country, that's starting to lack third spaces, defund education, and punish people for challenging the status quo. What I'm trying to say is, without a place for conversations to take place, without the knowledge to take part in conversations, and without the ability to have controversial conversations without punishment, these conversations cannot take place. Public thinking is essentially the antithesis to the happenings of our country today, and it's now become more important than ever to not only encourage it, but nurture it in the coming generations.
I thought that video was brilliant. Thank you so much, Mia, and thank you to all of our students who submitted videos this week. Again, I say it every week, always a challenge to choose one. I was not seeing the button to move to the next slide, but I have it here. So we will move into the next slide and, oh, I actually don't have it. Can someone please switch the slide to poll question 1? Awesome. Okay, so as Sammy mentioned, for students in the class, you will use iClicker as usual. And for community members joining us today, you will engage with the poll through Zoom, the Zoom polling feature. So these are some questions just designed to sort of gauge where you all are at you know, some of them are based on the readings, others are really just designed to see what we know as a group here, and we'll jump from there into Jason's talk. So poll question 1, what plants make you think of Black and or Indigenous history? Could it be A, coconut palm, B, sesame, C, sunflowers, or D, peanuts? And there's no right or wrong here. We're just sort of gauging where the community's at. On my end, it's a pretty equal distribution as far as students go, and it looks like community members as well, but it looks like only 15% of students and community members think of sesame as a Black and or Indigenous food. I'm sure we're going to get into that today, so we will give this question maybe 5 more seconds here. All right, let's move on to poll question number 2. Okay. Have you taken an environmental literacy class or workshop? A, yes. B, no. C, I'd like to. Or D, I'd prefer to take another environment-related course. So interesting to compare community versus students here. Looks pretty even. Most folks are saying no, they've never taken an environmental literacy class or workshop. And 32% of students are saying yes. Looks like a lot of folks would like to. Let's move on to question number 3. Back to sesame. How long do you think sesame seeds have grown in West Africa? Is it 2,000 years? More than 3,000 years? Less than 500 years? Or you don't know? All right, the answers are rolling in here. The correct answer is B, more than 3,000 years. And most of our students answered B. All right, one more poll question. Have you been to an archive? Yes, I visit an archive weekly. B, yes, I visited an archive. C, no. Or D, I'm not sure. It looks like most people, both in the class and in the community, have not visited an archive. Around 28% of students and 30% of community members have visited an archive. We have some people who visit an archive weekly. That's pretty cool. All right. That wraps up our polling question. I'm sure that Jayson is going to expand on these topics brilliantly in his talk. For now, I'm going to pass it on to Tiffany, one of our team members here on the educational side of things, to introduce Jayson.
Hi everyone, my name is Tiffany Harris, and I have the honor today of introducing Jayson Maurice Porter. Jayson is an environmental writer and historian who serves as a presidential postdoctoral fellow in the history department and a Black and Indigenous climate faculty fellow in the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. He specializes in Black and Indigenous environmental histories, agricultural systems, agrochemicals, cultural histories of ecology and botany, and environmental histories of revolution resistance and land reform. Beyond academia, he is also an environmental justice practitioner who supports and designs environmental literacy programs with a number of different institutions and communities, such as the Chicago Teachers Union Environmental Justice Freedom School, Rutgers University's Black Ecologies Lab, and the Indigenous Futures Lab at the University of Maryland, College Park. Lastly, he is an editorial board member of both the North American Congress on Latin America and Plant Perspectives in an interdisciplinary journal, and serves as the board member of One Square World, a nonprofit organization dedicated to creating liberatory systems for racial and environmental justice. Thank you so much, Jayson, for joining us today, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Tiffany. And just thank you for everyone for putting this together. It's a true honor to be here. I really hope I get a copy of Mia's video. Mia, first and foremost, wow, that was really cool. I wish I could make videos like that. I want to show that to my grandmother. I think she'll really appreciate it. I just was telling the really great host of this event that I just came out with an interview with my grandmother a couple weeks ago. So yeah, just really honored to be here. Just such a lovely presentation of community and then just care in terms of just like holding on to this or just take holding me in this moment. So I'm really excited to be here today. I'm excited to talk about reading, writing, and teaching Black environmental histories or ecologies of diaspora. I have the real distinct pleasure of being able to write about race and environmental histories in the Americas, principally in Mexico, southern Mexico, the state of Guerrero, which has the largest population of self-identifying people of African descent and today in Mexico. So I study that Pacific coast from Michoacan to Oaxaca. I'll show you some images. I'll situate you in place. We'll talk about how we do that work on some level today. So I'm just really honored to do that work. But then also I'm just really grateful to be a person who works at the University of Maryland, was born in the state of Maryland. I was born in Baltimore, and I'm from Philadelphia, so don't get it twisted. But my family, my ancestors have lived and worked in Maryland for hundreds of years. I take care of the plots of my seven ancestors dating back to 1856, and a distinctly Black cemetery next to one right down the street. You can see it from the Black cemetery, a white cemetery in a city a town that was established in 1689. And it's right up the road from where Harriet Tubman was an incredibly influential part of the Underground Road from Denton. This place is Snow Hill, and it's just a real cool pleasure of mine to also be able to work at a place situated like that and do family related history connected to my own living and deceased ancestors. So I'm excited to share with you guys several facets of myself and my work today. I really open, real questions from you guys. One of the things that Mia talked about in terms of the public thinker is really that I just don't think that I am one. I really asked my sister and my grandmother, whether or not they thought that I was. And in the interview, as some of y'all read, they said that they thought I was, and I was like, I okay. But I really think a lot of that's based on trust. So I hope in this space, I'm gonna come open and transparent with you guys and extend you that trust. And I look forward to hearing you guys' thoughts and honesty and transparency as much as you feel comfortable, or as much as I can help to create those conditions of comfort for you guys today. So yeah, so I'm gonna hit a lot of different points today, from really talking about like some of the work that I do as a practitioner, working on developing schools and spaces that are really rooted in thinking about environmental justice and race at once. I'm going to shift also and talk about research and distinctly what I do as a researcher, both on regards to working in Latin America, but also in the United States and places like Maryland. And then I'll kind of end with thinking about, the teaching will kind of come through in the beginning in parts and might come through a little bit in the end when we're thinking about writing. But if time permits, I'll do some sort of I'll do a short reading because I have a piece that's coming out next month on my father's birthday. Actually, it was actually accepted on my sister's birthday. She just turned 30 last week, and it'll come out on my father's birthday. So if time permits, I'll do a little sharing of that. So I just broke down kind of the roadmap of where we're going to go today. Like I said, we'll talk about teaching, research, and writing. I'll have a couple case studies I really want to share with you, thinking about trees of life and how we can narrate different histories of race through those. But I'm going to start with like where I'm coming from and a little bit of my personal background and shift from that into some of the work that I'm doing before I jump into the research. Oh, I should just say really quickly on this map, or on this photo, excuse me, I took this in Costa Chica and Costa Guerrero back in like maybe 2015. And it's one of the many uses of coconut palms that you see. So these are just slices of the coconut palm that are laid on the street as speed bumps. I don't know. One of the things I learned living in Jackson, Mississippi, and doing some, canvassing and knocking on doors, asking people like what they wanted, what they dreamed of in their neighborhoods, and what would they want more of, is one of the things that I heard more than anything. It wasn't that they were tired of the vacants, or they want another grocery store, or that they, wanted a closer gas station, or they wanted that toxic cotton mill that it had been dilapidated and not used for decades to like go somewhere and not, decrease value. No, they wanted speed bumps because they said they didn't feel comfortable with their kids just walking outside in the street and having fun in front of their home because people just treat it like a pass-through zone and would zoom by. And like that dream of just wanting to have the speed bumps really struck me when I saw coconut palms used as speed bumps in these communities where the state or had not built them. So I just thought that just was something that really resonated with me, and it really kind of speaks to some of the things that we'll talk about today, and like thinking about how we can read plants as and how we can read plants to help us tell stories about race and power. So this was in an Afro-descendiente community that had been growing coconut palms for decades, if not centuries. I keep on pressing my computer button, but I forget I need to press the button on the screen to move forward. Okay, so like I said, I'm a Baltimore-born Philadelphian. And I lived in Tucson and Jackson, Mississippi from the ages of 10 to 23. So I really sit with those places really deeply, Arizona and Mississippi. Kind of where I kind of developed a love and passion for thinking about like agricultural labor and what they experience, and just living in countries that just have never really cared for people working the land, be it enslaved or marginalized on an assortment of different ways. I come from a proud family of farmers and civil rights activists in Maryland and in Philadelphia. As a college student in Mississippi, I was a philosophy and environmental science major who helped museums and nonprofits design spaces for community art, food justice, and youth-centered environmental literacy. I was very, very lucky to get some jobs at the Children's Museum of Mississippi and the Art Museum, designing different curriculum. I'm happy to talk about that later. I helped run a food distribution warehouse in Jackson for years for an international hunger relief organization, collecting waste materials that were going to get thrown away and to repurpose those into meals. Now, like I said, I'm first and foremost an environmental historian of Guerrero. Guerrero is one of the most politically important regions, I think, in the African diaspora in the Americas. It's named after Vicente Guerrero. I'll talk a little bit more about him, but he was the first Afro-Indigenous president in the Americas, and he abolished slavery in Mexico in 1829, decades before it was abolished in the United States or other places in Latin America. Beyond these academic roles, I'm honored to work closely with scholars of plants and scholars of Latin America, those particularly doing works in politics. As an environmental justice practitioner, I do several different things that I'll talk a little bit more about in this next slide, to talk about a little bit more of the things that I've been working on around like teaching environmental justice and creating spaces for like, Black environmental design and kind of thought around those things. So at Northwestern, I helped the School of Engineering develop a module on teaching race and empire to engineers. And I've also developed kind of lesson plans and curriculum for the University of Michigan on water and arsenic. I can't remember. I think that was for the Department of Latin American Studies. Brown University, the Organic Trade Association, and the Mississippi Children's Museum and Art Museum. Currently, I'm really excited with some of the work that I'm doing with some of the like fields, like the labs that I feel like there's so many. I made a post on Blue Sky. I don't know if people use that yet. The other day, and about just like Black and Indigenous led lab spaces that are really bringing together like environmental humanities, plant humanities, critical race, Black studies, Indigenous studies in ways that combine research and politics. And I was recently in M. Murphy's technoscience research unit at the University of Toronto, and they are just doing just some of the most incredible work. You have Dark Laboratory by Tale Goff, the Black Ecologies Lab by Tiana Williams and JT Rowan at Rutgers, which I'm on the board of. Shelby Meisner has this Indigenous Futures Lab at the University of Maryland that is just doing really, really incredible stuff. I'm super honored to be a part of that. We're currently working on this curriculum that's doing extension work with agriculture and sustainability in the state of Maryland called Eating Takes Place, Being a Revolutionary Food Relative in Maryland, an interactive food workbook that we're currently designing. And that's also connected to some of the work that I've been doing, really just supporting two branches of the University of Maryland system in the Eastern Shore, where my family is from. Eastern Shore, Maryland Eastern Shore, which is HBCU, with their Environmental Science Center, which is not too far from my family's land. So the Environmental Science Center is a graduate program, but they're currently trying to design a program for undergrads from the HBCU to come to the center to do tons of different things, perhaps around like oyster restoration. There's a really, really storied past and history and present and hopefully future of particularly Black women oysters, cultivators, harvesters, shuckers throughout the Eastern Seaboard, but particularly in Maryland, also in the South. So there's a lot of energy around that. I'm interested to see if we can combine kind of Black women oysters narratives with like the Harriet Tubman tours that are in that same area. That could be something really powerful to think about, what it meant to like move through those spaces, in the Underground Railroad, looking for food, looking for clean water, thinking about clean water and food and how that related in the context of finding oysters. The last thing I'll say on this page, and I'm happy to dive a little bit more into this kind of environmental design and justice work a little bit more in the conversations, but I'll kind of end with some of the like school models that we're developing out of the Black Ecologies Lab and the Chicago Teachers Union. So in the Black Ecologies Lab, I'm more of a support as a curriculum designer. I have not led any of the development itself. I'm going to support a Mississippi field school in the next year, but so far I've been supporting these Black Ecologies field schools that bring youth, graduate students, faculty, and practitioners together in southern cities to meet with practitioners who are doing climate action work. That isn't the big top-down technocratic, state-sanctioned strategies, but they're like, the everyday what Black folks are doing in the South. They're creating a Black climate atlas, Tiona and JT, to really kind of, one of the things I kind of think about it as is like, in the context of climate crisis, one of the things that we've learned is that one of the biggest obstacles is that people don't know each other, right? And they don't know the resources right around them. So a lot of, creating these hubs is really about making sure that people are stronger neighbors and know what is around them. So when push comes to shove in that moment, they know who to reach out to, right? So in many ways, this Black Climate Atlas in some regard is trying to create a network, a conversation, so people don't think they're doing this climate action work by themselves and could see these nuances and differences between, experiencing climate change from one ecology versus the other, geography versus the next, right? So like, oh, that they have that tree in this region. Oh, I wonder, oh, that doesn't grow here, but what might we have that is also leguminous and might, have that relationship with the nitrogen cycle in that soil there, right? Or like, how can we put these pieces together so we can really learn from one another and be present for one another in these ways? So that's the Black Ecologies field school model. They're doing a small one in Philadelphia in a couple weeks. I'm going to attend. And then there's a big one in North Carolina in August, I believe, that the incredible Danielle Purifoy is going to be leading. They're also a board member. And I'll end with the Chicago Teachers Union Freedom School. So that model is really inspired by colleague and friend Aisha Kasi Lambert, who started something called the Chicago Environmental Educators. And they were essentially, many ways like Chicago has the mayor Brandon Johnson today, because as the leader of the teachers union for years, you know, they fought back from all the school closures that happened in Black and Mexican communities, right? So, and to kind of get some of the city back, and Aisha was really using these vacant schools that had been gutted by the city as, you know, hubs to teach climate space. You know, a lot of young people in Chicago and all around the country and around the world are asking to learn more about climate and learn more about environment, particularly environmental justice in their schools, because they're concerned about it. Which gets into a whole conversation about like how do we care for young people that are learning, wanting to learn these things and learning such devastating, heavy information. How can we hold them and be supportive of them as they're experiencing these difficult, you know, having these difficult conversations and learning these tough lessons, right? So that's the thing that we're doing with the environmental justice freedom schools, because they're pushing a green schools initiative, which is essentially trying to make schools more permeable, particularly in flooding zones in Chicago. You know, make schools have permeable pavements, permeable surfaces, so they actually can help the water circulation system, and so it doesn't like overflow, and they can be kind of like they can take on some extra water during flooding times, but then also really addressing asbestos and lead in water. Essentially, Chicago schools are around 84 years old. Averages was about double the average of most schools in the United States, average about 42 years old. So essentially, when we had the students meet with the, you know, the designer or the person who's in charge of the $500 million worth of repairs in Chicago public schools every year, and he essentially says, when I test, I assume there's going to be lead, or I assume there's going to be asbestos when I go into every room, when I turn every knob. The thing is that we're trying to maintain how much lead gets into the water or how friable is the asbestos, right? So they're always trying to maintain that and keep that at bay. So essentially, we're trying to get student perspectives on the different, you know, environmental related crises that are happening in schools, so they can offer their own perspectives on this Green School Initiative, and then they can give presentations to the mayor or the Chicago public school system about how they want to see these, you know, take place within their schools, which aren't receiving these initiatives at the same rate. So that's been happening since 2023. We just had to give back $100,000 to the EPA just a few weeks ago, because our grant that we had worked for a while had been rescinded. But the show must go on. But I'm happy to talk about, you know, just strategies in terms of like how to get this type of funding in this context today. So that's just a little bit about kind of the teaching kind of work in this space right now. All right, so I'm going to shift gears to talk a little bit about research and researching like Black environmental histories, and really kind of get to some reason like how I got to this. And a lot of it starts with an archival issue, that's really rooted in, you know, racial violence in the Americas, the United States, in this case particularly in Mexico. And so I mentioned earlier, I studied the state of Guerrero, which is named after Vicente Guerrero, who abolished slavery in 1829. He also, in so doing, abolished the demarcation of being of African descent in Mexico in 1829. So from 1829 to 2020, so almost 200 years, there's no official demarcation in the archive. Official record of, you know, someone being of African descent. A racial, or, you know, to some extent cultural distinction is made if someone speaks an indigenous language that is not Spanish. But for different reasons of, you know, just racial violence, you know, West African languages, you know, like Wolof or Bambara, they didn't make the diaspora, you know, transfer in the same way. And then most people of African descent just spoke Spanish, or they're Afro-Indigenous and were marked as someone who was indigenous, not necessarily someone that's Black. So in this context, I really am inspired by a lot of different scholars, environmental scholars, scholars of race in the Americas, that have used kind of plant narratives to kind of find other angles to telling histories of race, particularly Black history, or histories of the diaspora in the Americas. So for me, in the context of Coastal Guerrero, I kind of fell on oil seeds for an assortment of different reasons. I think one, it was always there. oilseeds have always had kind of an imperial relationship with this region. So before the Spanish, forcibly displaced people of African descent and brought about 200,000 of them to Mexico and, tens of thousands to this coast in the 17th and 18th century. This was a region of the Tlaponec, the Nahua, and the Musco, who were forced to pay tribute to the Aztec Empire through cacao, which is an oil seed. So there was an imperial relationship there, and it was that cacao that the Spanish then built plantations around in the context of empire and colonialism in the late 16th and early 17th century. And it was in that same kind of plantation economy around cacao, that first oil seed, they transitioned into cotton. And that was the predominant oilseed and plantation crop in the region until the independence movement, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So in this map here that was made by one of my favorite people, landscape architect Elisa Diamond, and close collaborated with the Black Ecologies Lab. This map shows across this region, the coastal municipalities, which regions grew these different oil seeds, be it coconut, cotton, and sesame, which I'll get a little bit more into as I continue. So real quick, what are oil seeds? The term oil seeds or oleaginous crop, or oligenosa in Spanish, is a socioeconomic term rather than a botanical or biological term. Most seeds produce oils, but socioeconomic oil seeds produce enough oils to make them profitable to soap, vegetable oil, and other industries. A lot of historical works on race and oil seeds, such as Jory Lewis's James Beard Award-winning Slaves for Peanuts, also show how valuable oil seeds were in their Black environmental knowledge and for Black community formation. So I'll get into some other books like Case Watkins' Palm Oil Diaspora, where he follows the oil palm, which has centuries of history in connection with spirituality and alimentation and life, in West Africa, was distinctly used by planters and enslavers to transfer across the Atlantic to help sustain slavery and to create environments where slavery could become possible. He looks at like how in Northeast Brazil, in the Bahia, you have a combination of, oil palms that grow in very similar ways as they grew in West Africa, but also in ways that are emergent and defy, standardization. So they were brought there to, grease in many ways the wheels of enslavement and this, that slave economy. But at the same time, they became tools for enslaved people to make spaces of their own as well. Places, things that were familiar, spiritualities that were familiar. So that's something that's really, really, those types of works have been inspiring for me to think about them. Another thing that's, that's interesting for me, especially in the context of, let's say Senegal and Costa Chica, which are the two places that I've been this year apart from Canada, is largely because if you look on a map and you see the coast of Guerrero versus the ecotone of Senegal that starts to transition towards the Sahara, you'll see they're about maybe 1.5 degrees latitude different. And I promise you, if I showed pictures, and I should have showed pictures of Senegal, the countryside, the coast of Senegal versus the coast of Guerrero, you would be like, which is which? You would not know. I think Senegal's a touch more thorny, and I have questions as to why that's the case. But I promise you, like the shades and hues of the greens, the way it transitions to these dirt roads, and like even their sediment, like the way the gravel is broken up into, I promise you, it's strikingly similar. They have these dry tropical coastal environments, which are important for several reasons, I would say. And this is important for just thinking and reading through these landscapes is dry tropical forests like these ecotones that were both, these these areas that had extended dry seasons of 7 to 9 months, but had these torrential, 3-month long wet seasons, that can maintain really tropical crops, but for grand part of the year, were very, 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 very dry. These are important for an assortment of reasons. One, these are where most plantations are in the history of plantations until recently, because you don't have to move that much biomass. Their climatic cycles are more conducive to crop cycles than, let's say, a humid tropical zone, that has more pathogens, that has, too much rain, that has too many fungi. If you look at the history of plantations across the Caribbean or across the Pacific, you will see they're in places that have extended dry seasons as opposed to too much water, right? That is something that's consistent in terms of just mapping out, plantation zones. I think it's also important because it helps us think about, okay, what do plants do to survive these long, dry seasons, particularly when you have thirsty, plants and animals looking for water to drink. You create these oils as, almost defense mechanisms. My dear beloved botanist friend Maya would say they're not quite defense mechanisms. So I need to take that back a little bit. But they are like, so, this is where we get into like writing and the poetic latitude of kind of speaking through plants and plant life and that multi-species kind of poetics and stuff. I think sometimes as someone who works with paleoclimatologists and botanists and geographers, and biochemists, I'm oftentimes just like, hey, chill out right there. So I think they might take a, rightfully, and I'm grateful for them always, for, them reminding me to slow down. But you see in these dry tropical spaces, plants will grow more of these oils to actually sustain life throughout these periods, which I think is super, super powerful to think about. And it's also where you have, these oil seeds become more economic because they're more oil bearing. So in these dry tropical places that are historically plantation zones, you actually have plants oftentimes grow more energies that can then be extracted in ways. So I think these are ways that we can narrate power and think about how power moves even through, the relationship between sun, water, and plant as it moves around. So one of the things I just do in terms of my narrative is really kind of reading the history of Coastal Guerrero through coconuts and other oily seeds. So I talked about cacao and its transition to cotton. Coconut was the next really major oil seed crop that was really invested in by U.S. Plantation owners, landowners in the late 19th century and early 20th century when they started developing the imperial relationship with the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. The United States became more and more invested in this kind of like global coconut economy, and people just started trying to grow coconuts in all these different places. And this became the kind of really interesting seed for people after the revolution, because a lot of after the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1920 was a really political one where people were fighting for land and access to land and access to market. And a lot of the peasant landless farmers who had grown some of these coconuts for these U.S. companies and Spanish companies that now had been removed from Mexico in the context of the post-revolutionary period, we're saying, okay, we grew those coconuts, so we want to use that as kind of the basis to solicit our ejido, or our collective land grant, right? So in this region, in this Afro-Indigenous region, the coconut palms that had been, repatriated from these, U.S. U.S. companies like United Fruit Company became kind of the basis for like land reform. And I think that's really powerful because just 100 years earlier, in the context of the independence movement, in the 1810s, it was Afro and indigenous sharecroppers of cotton that were the major contingent for Vicente Guerrero when he was able to outlast the Spanish. So let me be very clear about this. I need to get a sip before I have to be real clear about this. Hold on. So this is just one example of why it's very powerful to study race and oil seeds in the context of Mexico. Because from 1816 to 1820, there was only a single contingent, and by contingent I mean force, military force, that was actively fighting against the Spanish in Mexico. By 1816, all other independence movements had failed. There was one, and that was Vicente Guerrero and his Afro-Indigenous cotton sharecroppers, who, through understanding of this environment, were able to fight a guerrilla war that outlasted the Spanish and brought Mexico to independence when it did. So there would be no Mexican independence as it happened, how it happened, without, you know, this taking place the way it did, or without the history of race and oil seeds in this region. So I think that's just really an important example that kind of crystallizes it. I think from the absence of time, I'm going to skip over that. Oh, well, okay. So I'm going to just bring a little bit more kind of like forward example to thinking about like how we can also like kind of read, you know, power into just some of the food that we just see around us. So one of the narratives that I think is really powerful for me, I pulled from this quote from Procter and Gamble, from 1931, that says that the process of washing is largely a process of coating the body with a solution which is strong enough to take off dirt but not strong enough to take off skin. And the region that I've been talking about becomes one of the centers of soap production in Mexico and ultimately the hemisphere, because a lot of these oil seeds are the base for soap. So Procter and Gamble, Nestle, and Aceite Uno Dos Tres, like all these different multinational companies develop headquarters there to produce soap and other byproducts of oil seeds. So I say that in the book that I'm working on, I say that this quote might be true. You know, the process of washing or the process of making soap might be a delicate one that, you know, is strong enough to remove dirt but not strong enough to remove skin. I said that might be true, but if you look at the agriculture, if you look at who it displaces, if you look at the factories and who it impacts, that the process of making soap, the process of growing the raw materials for soap, is a process that's strong enough to remove dirt and skin. And so I think that's one of the ways I've kind of I've started to think about, you know, processed foods and their just impact, you know, not necessarily just to our health and, you know, our economies, but also to our land and to the farmers that produce them. Another example I think about quite a bit that I've written on a little bit is thinking about this idea of reading a label that says this may contain peanut oil, sesame seed oil, coconut oil, you know, or safflower oil, right? And you know, these fats and other interchangeable elements of vegetable power. I say, what happens to growers when a label reads this may contain coconut oil or palm oil? Multinationals seek to maximize their profits while agricultural communities struggle to survive between boom and bust cycles. This process renders communities as fungible as the oils they produce. This label, in many ways, it shows a lack of responsibility or a lack of guarantee between the producer and the processor, to basically say that we have the technology, we have the science to manipulate the triglycerides in ways, you know, to, basically take sesame if it's cheaper, even though we usually use coconut oil, or to take safflower when it's more available, when there's, another crop is, more expensive. So I think that allows the interchangeability of these seed crops to really adversely affect those who grow them around the world, who are constantly competing with one another, for companies that are not invested in them or are not committed to them. So this is another way that I think it's one of the ways that I read agricultural history through processing, but I think it's also just a way of kind of narrating, and we do it quite a bit. Thinking about now, you'll see signs outside of places that say we don't do seed oils, but I still think that narrative is mostly around consumer health, which is important, but I think it's also important to think about how these things adversely affect people. So in the instant of time, which I think I'm doing pretty good on time, so we might not have a reading at the end, which I think is totally fine. But I want to talk a little bit more about thinking of like plant archives as sites of proxies and methods. And this really taps into a little bit of the reading that I suggested around proxies for justice. Oops, excuse me, I'm making a mess. So I asked, what is a plant archive? A plant archive is a species or specimen that shares historical information through a proxy or methodological analysis. It is a site of proxies and methods that help us decipher the possibilities of how our land is going to change. And let me be clear, I am not the plant archive police. These are how I'm thinking through these ideas today. I might think differently about them in 6 months, and I'm surely not going to tell anybody that this is not what this is exactly what an archive is. This is exactly the distinction between an archive and a method and a proxy. These are things that I do think are being used by so many different disciplines in so many different ways. So I'm coming from a very limited perspective as someone who does history and environmental history in particular. This might look very, very different from a literature scholar or a Black Studies scholar or a paleoclimatologist or a geoscientist. So I just want to be very clear. But some examples of plant archives are tree rings, pollen, lake bed sediments, corals, I would argue plantation crops, palms, and other oil seeds. So what is a proxy? They are physical, geochemical, biological, and geological measurements that provide historical data from a natural archive. Examples of this include bacterial lipids captured in lake bed sediments. So what is a plant archival method? I would argue that these are systematic or speculative approaches that follow plants and historical archives to triangulate and isolate data, patterns, or narrative. I would say see the following on these oil seeds. I love Claudia Leal's Landscapes of Freedom. I already mentioned Case Watkins' Palm Oil Diaspora and Jory Lewis's Slaves for Peanuts. Happy to dive into those a little bit more. So what are plant archives, proxies, and methods for justice? Archives and proxies that provide historical and climatic data on the regions experiencing climate crisis most immediately, tropical and subtropical regions. Consider tree rings and what they tell us and what they don't show us. Do they do the tropics justice? So I can go a little bit. I don't know if I have a slide on this next. Of examples of books I've mentioned that you should definitely check out on the Black History of Palms. But I want to talk a little bit about tree rings and dendrochronology is kind of like a narrative that's so powerful and important, but it shows the kind of limitations of plant archives as construed in the context of the politics of knowledge that's rooted in the global north. So a tree ring in many ways, for most cases, is a demarcation of a wintering period. It is when the vascular cambium of a tree stops to grow when it gets too cold. So if you don't have a winter, you don't have a tree ring in a way that really speaks to like a year or a consistent kind of change. Obviously becoming more inconsistent through climate change, and that's something that is measured. But that means that for most of the world experiencing climate change in the most immediate violent ways, in the tropics and subtropics, we don't have tree rings in the same way that if you slice open a tree, you'll see these marks that allow us to, justly understand how climate is changing in the tropics. So in many ways, you have scholars of the tropics, from the tropics, arguing that we need different types of narratives, different types of archives that, are rooted in tropical perspectives, are rooted in tropical spaces. So I throw out the baobab tree as a tree of life that I think is really that, that these live 2,000 years. And in this example of a tree I took a picture of a couple weeks ago in Senegal, you actually see some storytellers who are buried inside the baobab tree, which was a practice that was banned in the 1960s, a practice that extended for hundreds of years in this region of burying storytellers in these trees. These trees also have scarification and different growing pains that I think might be ways of helping us understand time, climate change in some of these regions, as well as maybe nitrogen signatures as legumes, and having particular relationships with the soil and the vegetation around them. Also, they are so situated in the life cycles of so many different plants and animals around them. It might be able to show the relationship between baobab and speciation, diversity, and things along those lines to help us map, where certain species are growing or have grown or traveled or moved, similar to the way people use the palms as a way to kind of study how the Sahara has shifted. And that's something I didn't mention earlier about thinking about the Senegambian region, which is really cool, and thinking about Mexico and Senegal being close, is it's actually in the Senegambian region, and Edith Fields Black does this research best on like where West Africans, Papa, stop, that's my dog. Chewy, stop. I'm sorry. He never barked. Oh shoot. Oh, it's sorry. And so I think something that's really, really powerful about this is that you actually have the case where in the context of Senegal, it's in that distinct ecotone that West Africans not only they didn't domesticate rice there because it was domesticated in Mali, but they were able to in those areas where the river systems were changing and the Sahara was expanding, they were able to figure out how to grow rice in different microclimates. And it's that Senegambian community that was particularly was targeted as rice growers in the context of the transatlantic slave trade. So that particular set of Black ecological knowledge is what spread in many parts around the Americas, you know, with sesame growing cultures and rice growing cultures. So I think that's something that's really interesting that also speaks to this kind of region and this plant. Um, so the last thing I'll say, and really thinking about these other oil seeds in this area, is thinking about how the coconut palm could be um, a similar crop that we could use to tell these stories. And it's once was called the big game crop of the plant world. Some have some are actually as old as 80 million years. And you can read Empire through this. There's a great quote I know from the Tropical Agriculture that says the civilized world of the temperate zone can absorb all of the oil and fiber in tropics are likely to send for generations to come, however great the supply. And in many ways, this helps us think about how oil seeds in the context of this transition from the coal age to the petroleum age at the turn of the 20th century, really central to kind of the energy history of the world. This is really what you know what the world was building on. It's what we created early plastics out of. It's what we create early processed foods out of. It's we ran machines out of them. We made more calories out of them. And so in many ways, they became fundamental in developing spaces, not just in the temperate north, but also in the globalizing and industrializing south. So in the context of agrarian reform in this region that I've talked about today, these oil seeds become really essential in the transition of agricultural producers in the industrialization of their countries. And you, just like I had mentioned before, how these Afro-Indigenous communities were seeking out coconuts to, you know, integrate into the agrarian reform of the country. They're also thinking about how to do that in the industrial way too. So you see this, you know, Afro-Mexican family at the bottom actually drying out coconut shells that they can then press. And you know, it's really cool when I found this picture, the whole archive shut down. And people came from all different parts of the archive to see this picture. And you know, from finding this picture and other pictures like the one above, I've helped to like add to their phototeca or their photo archive lab or a photo archive section to kind of build this out because these agrarian archives are not very well organized or really comprised of complaints and maps and all sorts of different things. Really juicy stuff oftentimes. But oil seeds become one of the ways to actually navigate and find people, find pictures, find life in the context where it's been so difficult. So I offer these oil seeds as an opportunity to do some digging and to read into some of these landscapes, some of these histories that have been so hard to find. I think I'm doing pretty good on time, so I think I'm going to end it here and open it up for questions, and I can dive into anything else in better detail. I didn't really round it up in Sesame like I planned to, and I know I didn't get into the reading, so I'm sorry if anybody feels any type of way, but I promise I'm happy to send that out and it'll be coming out soon. But I just like to say thank you guys so much for your time and care, and I really look forward to further engagement.
Thank you, Jason. What a very rich talk. A lot was happening, and you do a lot as a scholar and educator and a community activist, I guess I would say. Maybe that should be the first question for you. You talked about the blending of politics and scholarship, and you've mentioned everything that you do, how you blend both together, but you're also a public figure. Can you talk about the blending of all of this together in your work, in your career, and how you feel about it?
I mean, I don't I'm working honestly. I'm no public figure, so I feel really weird even responding to that. That's very generous. But I honestly feel like in many ways, working in the university, particularly now, like I was on campus a few weeks ago, and they were probably on campus this week. We're trying to monitor some of those, some of those networks and find some of the spaces for students to go, when ICE is on campus. I mean, working on the university right now is tough, right? It's a place that actively harms, right? And it actively beats down on you, no matter if you're working staff, professor, student. It's a tough place to be, right? And working in an environment, it's also a really, really tough thing to do. You see your students cry. You see, your friends cry. You see people break down. So it's something that it actively requires healing, right? Like it's something that like you actively have to like protect yourself. You actively have to, work on healing. You actively have to have tough conversations, and be around people to do this work, and that was something I learned young, just going through a lot and working with young people, is that like I can do anything if I work with other people, especially young people. And like, like in my darkest, deepest troubled times, like I just be working with some 3 or 4 year olds and they would bring me back to life. Or I would work with, my grandmother, or work with some elders and they bring me back to life. And I think that type of intergenerational, connection is the healing that I've needed to do the work, and want to be a part of the work, So honestly, I feel like it really starts with doing the work is tough and it leaves you with scars straight up. Like that is where it starts. Like, and I think to me, like it's easiest to kind of do them together because it just feels, honestly, it just feels most genuine. Like, so a part of the reason why you hear EJ stuff in Maryland and research in Mexico is because, it's so cool. I've been studying Guerrero for 12 years and I know people from community who are now working on PhDs to do the work. The climate action work that needs to happen in Guerrero will never be done best by me. You know what I'm like? That's not for me to do. That's not my place. I have like a humble space as a historian and writer to like, support when I can, how I can, right? But like where I stand in Maryland, like a place where I want to continue building my own personhood, my own life, that own life work. I feel much more comfortable saying, you know what, my grandparents fought for that shit. You know what I'm saying? Like that's a different space to come from. So I feel like it's having those two things and having different spaces that allow me to feel most honest where I stand.
Thank you for this. And I think we see it with Proxies for Justice. Your work is very collaborative. It's about sharing, even the way you talk about being a public speaker. In some way you say you're not, but you are as well. Which relates to a question from Emily. Her question is, Jayson, as someone who also interested in teaching environmental justice, how do you balance teaching necessary topics on climate change and oppression to children without overwhelming them? I think it's a really good question.
That's a great question. That's a great question. First, I would say I'm a little rusty. I say I'm not, my day-to-day isn't in front of children anymore. I get to work with high schoolers every year. I honestly, it's weird. I'm in a place where I actually hear from high schoolers pretty regularly who are like applying to like work at Maryland and like, can I work with you if I go to college there? And I'm like, that's not how college works. Let me just be straight up. But I'm a little out of that space generally. But I think one, I would say like for me, you don't have to, for me, like I don't feel like you have to bring that much curiosity in that spaces if you like really trust the young people to bring their own questions and their own experiences and really start to like think about cultivating that and valuing that. So starting with like different types of games that really center their questions and their listening. So they start to ask better questions and listen to each other and really see that like listening to each other is actually the best way to ask better questions. Then you really can run with that. So I think like really starting with their own curiosity, and like you don't have to get too dark. Like you don't have to get too heavy right away. Like I don't think any of that's really, really necessary. I think the important thing is to like straddle. My dog is just making all the noise. Is to straddle the question of like what they feel like they can do versus not feeling like the onus is on them to like make the change. Like, so understanding that structural versus that individual on some level, so they can start to see like, the decision isn't on them to like, mom, like, why aren't we doing this? Like the sky is falling. Why do we have plastic bags? Like, to try to understand kind of like where plastic comes from at the same time that you're teaching them that maybe we can think about not using them, right? Like, so it's not like you're just putting it on them like, oh, you need to like not do this. It's like, no, to think about where they come from and really cultivate a form of question asking about them so they can start to see like, oh, I wonder where that came from, or like where are all the chickens? I feel like I've had chicken today, but I haven't seen a chicken in like a year. So start asking those questions, and I think like run with that has been one of the ways I feel like having those conversations is most effective.
Thank you. And it seems like from what you say and your personality as a researcher, since everything is so collaborative, as you said again today, you have to know where the people are, how you can share with people where the resources are. Same with children, we're in it together. I think that's what you're trying to do as well in your work with children. It's not for them alone to resolve the problem. We're in it together. It's about sharing and discussing. Which brings me to a question from Proxies for Justice that had a lot of success, as I told you. It's an article that people really like. It's a question from an anonymous. There is no name here. Here's the question. In your co-authored article, Proxies for Justice, can you tell us more about how we can support institutions that fund research in understudied tropical people and lands? Also, have you given a talk about this article? Very important concept, an interesting paper, by the way. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for the question, anonymous person. I appreciate dearly. I have given a talk on it. I've given a couple actually. Most recently at the University of Toronto School of Environment last month. And Lena and I are still thinking about how to keep it going, and still think about talking about that. I don't know why I'm forgetting the first part of the question.
It's about how we can support institutions.
Oh yes, that's right. I'm so sorry, anonymous person. That's a great question. So this is a tough one. I think I think a lot of it needs to be on like data sharing and data standardization. I think that's huge. I think it's really unfortunate that, a lot of institutions in the global north have access to resources in the global south without the inverse. So I think starting at the university level, let's say if the University of Maryland has access to climate data at the University of Buenos Aires or the University in Bogota or the University in Cali, that relationship should be reciprocated, and their university system should have access to download our documents, and that honestly is not usually the case, and that is alone kind of crazy. So I think like if we're developing these relationships in the tropics to study these things and go to these places and develop research institutes and develop hubs and take things that we call research but are vacations, that I think we need to do better at making sure that there's equity there, and making sure that, but that also still can create global North centric, hubs. So I've seen cases where I was recently in a conversation with tons of African scholars around the environment at a summit, and they were concerned about a lot of the successful quote unquote data sharing kind of programs oftentimes will create like an overly centric, sort of set of data that's really rooted in, temperate or high altitude or high latitude spaces, right? So there's a problem there as well. So I think a lot of it needs to also just think about investing, not away from entirely, let's say like, archives that are rooted in temperate zones or Arctic zones like ice cores or tree rings. But we need to invest more. So that's why the article kind of looked at like, starting to look more at, dry, precipitation-based tree rings, particularly in the rainiest parts of Colombia, has actually started to find some tropical tree rings, right? And how powerful that can be if we just spend more time, pushing against some of these narratives that we think certain archives hold particular proxies, because those proxies and those formulas are oftentimes rooted in like temperate data, right? Like, and that doesn't necessarily help us tell stories in the tropics. So I think there's some paradigm shifting formulas, honestly, and archives that need to happen. But I also I think that a lot of these things are happening already. So the most expeditious thing would be to support what's already going on, because people are always on the ground doing things, just need more support.
Just a follow-up question before I go to Taylor, or a team member who also has an interesting question for you, but just a follow-up question about tree rings, which I think it was fascinating in an article, how you showed this kind of proxies and how we can read them. Because you're very much into semantics, I see this, the way you talk. And you talked about climate scientists and how they tell you, oh, whoa, watch out, don't use defense mechanism. There are different words. So you're very careful with words. In the article and today as well, you talked about scars and scarification. Is it something, is it your term? Because I had never heard it enough and it's so interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about, if it's not, why do we use the word scars and how do you read it yourself?
Yeah, well, definitely not my term. That is definitely like a botanical and biological term. A lot of different seeds can't grow without being like scarred. So you really just need like some type of like rupture in the membrane, like the seed membrane for it to start to grow, oftentimes to like grow out of it. A lot of plants, for instance, won't only grow after fires, right? Or only grow after floods. There's that oftentimes, plants are triggered by these climactic shifts to like set to start living, right? So that scarification can oftentimes happen just from extreme aridity. So like it's just one of those, it's one of the major mechanisms through which life starts to like, shake out the seed, if you will. I wish I could say I was as careful with my words when I'm speaking. I try. But that's very nice of you. I hope that answers the question, but it's definitely not my term. It's a real
Thank
thing
you.
out there. Mhm.
So now on to Taylor. I'm looking at doing some research around how children think about food justice, food security, trying to get at the epistemic injustices around different food cultures. Is there any participatory action research, community-based research that has inspired you? In particular, any with the food sovereignty, food justice, environmental justice focus?
Honestly, I feel like more like individuals and just practitioners. So like for instance, like the Proxies for Justice article that you read was inspired by working with fifth graders with Lena. We spent, months working with fifth graders on teaching them about tree rings and actually developing different proxies using Skittles and stuff. And we have the lesson plan is available online if you're interested on checking it out. So working with different practitioners has been really inspiring for me. In the Chicago Teachers Union, I have the pleasure of working with a Jackson Potter, and just seeing this man move in front of young people is just crazy cool. Like you could just tell he's been in the classroom for so long, and he's just as the vice president of the Teachers Union and being in charge of 30,000 teachers as well as over a million, like almost a million students. You just to see somebody who moves through a city and people just run up to him no matter where you are, and he's like, "Oh, how's your principal doing?" I didn't really like them either. Like, and just able to like have, so I feel like I just have really, really, I'm just surrounded by incredible educators, on a lot of different levels of my life, that are just inspiring. I mean, even today I was giving feedback, um, from my girlfriend who's a teacher about just something I'm writing, and that was really formative. So I just really feel like I'm just surrounded by, just inspiring and thoughtful educators. That's just something that just motivates me. I've been really lucky my whole life with that. So yeah, I don't know if that answered the question fully, in terms of inspiration. I will say, like, I started off getting certified in philosophy for children at Montclair University in North Carolina, or excuse me, in New Jersey, back in 2011, 2012. They have a really, really well-established philosophy for children curriculum. I really am grounded in their kind of pedagogy of community of inquiry, which the literature is out there for that, and you can find it on that website. But I'm happy to talk a little bit more about it if you have a follow-up, or if this is just like woefully inadequate as a response. I'm sorry, but so I would say I'm a little grounded in that. As I think like a really cool heuristic that I use from place to place.
Thank you. I'm
Yeah.
going to try to sneak in two more questions
All
in the
right, let's go.
next 2 minutes if we can. If not, one is fine too. We can end with that one.
Okay.
I don't know who this question come from, but how can we connect Harriet Tubman and her fight for freedom with Black women who are involved with oyster harvesting?
That's a great question. I love that. Honestly, I think it's happened and I think it's gonna happen already. So one, you know, it's crazy. I think like my family's from a rural racist area, and I feel like they name all these things after Harriet Tubman, and they like just go on being racist, and it's like it like absolves them of everything. So like one, like don't get it twisted. Just riding down the Harriet Tubman Highway, these folks, they're not, you know, just for you. So it is sometimes a struggle working in this place. I have an 89-year-old uncle who is a city council member fighting, you know, every day against people. So, but I think it's cool. They do have like this infrastructure of like Harriet Tubman tours. And I do think that these are also in places that have like the world, like the Eastern Seaboard's largest like community oyster hatchery. So it's really interesting. I don't know if you guys know like how oysters grow, but it's all about like convincing this like microorganism to like attach to a shell, and then like it's called spat on shell, and like it's from that like colonies of oysters grow from a shell. So the shells are actually like the limiting factor in like sustaining oysters. So if you create like an oyster collecting system, you can like, you know, grow more oysters. So there's like some really dope like oyster restoration programs. Like literally, community has collected millions and millions and millions of shells. You can climb mountains of them, I promise you. And these are in areas that Black women in particular have been like the harvesters of these oysters. And I really think we need to think about their knowledge systems. You know, you go anywhere around the Black diaspora, Senegal, Brazil, Mexico, you'll see Black women in relations with oysters. And I think like centering their experiences and their knowledge that is being used in getting that spat on shell, when we think about what algae we're using to like convince the microorganism to come over. Like these are things that weren't necessarily codified in literature and had publications on them, but they existed in the Black experience in the way that our ancestors shaped landscape, right? And so, like, so I definitely think we can center that. And I would love to see these Harriet Tubman tours to integrate some of the thinking about where oysters were found, what's the role of the oysters in the Underground Railroad, what was Harriet Tubman's relationship with oysters. I want to read her journals and see if she mentions oysters anywhere. And I have zero doubts there's some oysters somewhere, at least something on some shellfish, you know? So I think that could be really powerful. And the last thing I'll say is like, there's some really cool, like community supported fisheries that are doing this incredible things to trying to reconnect people that have historically been connected to the ocean and connected to seafood that no longer have access to it. So like Fishadelphia is one of my favorite ones in Philadelphia. And I'm actually not privy to any in Maryland. So that is I had to feel I don't know that. I need to get on top of that. So thank you for the question. I have work to do.
Thank you. And Jason, it's going to be our last question because there was so much enthusiasm. We see how you carry passion for what you do. So I think we should leave it right there because I think it was really palpable in the last question because you're thinking about anticipating what you're going to do next and what you could do and all the possibilities that you have into narrating those stories. So thank you very much for speaking with us today.
A pleasure.
It was a pleasure really having you today. So
Thank you.
now I'm going to pass it on to who is next?
It's me.
Thank you.
I'm gonna sorry, having a little trouble with my camera here. But I have a few announcements as we wrap up this evening. So April 15th is the 10th annual Fast Food for Thought. We have 10 but both faculty and staff who will be giving 5-minute talks related to food and agriculture. We have a wonderful lineup. And I think we'll probably say a little bit more about that next week, but wanted to provide some more information that that's coming up in a couple weeks. There's also an invitation to participate in a collaborative cookbook for Asian American adoptees. This is coming from a student who is an adoptee themselves and is interested in exploring the nuances of the transnational adoptee experience, especially how food is a means of cultural identity and cultural expression. If you identify as a transnational Asian American adoptee and would like to contribute to the cookbook, you can add your name at the form in the chat. Seating dialogue is continuing This is a bi-weekly series that includes reading circles and art craft activities. The next one is April 4th and includes seeds as deep time technologies and paper making. And next week, we'll be having or learning from 3 Michigan-based changemakers, Angie Sanchez, Kadada Green, and Jay Clement. The panelists will share their work on equitable and health-promoting breastfeeding and first food initiatives. Angie Sanchez is Crane Clan, is Ojibwe and Odawa from Michigan. She is a PhD candidate at Michigan State University, where she was awarded a Michigan Health Endowment Fund grant to bring Indigenous breastfeeding counselor training program to 6 different Indigenous communities throughout Michigan. Kadada Green is the founding executive director of Black Mothers Breastfeeding Association, an organization she established in 2007 to support Black mothers in her community. And Jay Clement is the vice president of community health programs and strategies at Henry Ford Health, overseeing initiatives aimed at improving community health and equity. So we really look forward to that next week. And again, just want to offer a warm and big thank you to Jayson Maurice Porter for everything that he shared this evening. We'll see you all next week.